right, let's get my tech going here. Can I get a confirmation that you can see the correct PowerPoint? Thank you. That's always the most anxiety producing part of doing a presentation on Zoom. I appreciate everybody joining in today for this exciting topic. And before we get started, I am live streaming from the University of Washington in Seattle. We acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Also, just want to lay out there that, you know, the COVID pandemic topic is a bit raw, I think, for all of us who have been through the last year and a half. And, you know, as we start to have some glimmers of hope and recovery, the accumulated trauma that's occurred in our industry and in our society may come out and manifest in different ways. So it's okay to have a variety of reactions to this topic in general. And I would just also implore you to be attentive to that topic in your own organizations and with your own teams. We don't know when, how, or why some of that post-traumatic stress might come out. And that's, I think, really an important part of our recovery and the you know, helpers that have been on the front lines in our business for the last year and a half. The presentation today is about a topic also from the context of my own institution and my own experience, but my hope is that there are some transferable nuggets that, regardless of your role, institution type, country, location, that you can help translate some of this back into your own efforts. The pandemic also occurred in the midst of a civil rights movement, political unrest in the US, at least, in an economic crisis. So there's a lot to unpack here, and we're not going to solve the problems of the world today, but want to take a moment because I do really think it's important to synthesize at critical moments of what we've learned so that we can translate that into future action. My name's Josh Gana. Thanks, Becca, for the introduction. I'm Associate Director of Housing and Food Services at UW in Seattle. My primary role is overseeing our facilities operations, which includes departmental emergency management. As you can see from some of the photos on the screen here, I also do that type of work for fun, for free as a volunteer with King County Search and Rescue, some major festivals and events in the Seattle area as well, including the 4th of July and the Seafair Festival. Within the UW, I participated in the last year on our advisory committee on communicable diseases and the King County Higher Education Housing Task Force, as well as the NWACUHO's COVID occupancy group. So I do bring a variety of perspectives to this conversation. I'm a former Northwest NWACUHO president and also sit on the NWACUHO board. So that is enough about me. Wanted to give you all an opportunity to just share if there's anything in particular you're hoping to get from the session today, and you can either put that in the chat box or, if you'd like, unmute and share. So what are you hoping to learn or get today? Sip my coffee.
Something I'm hoping to learn is during emergency times, how do we continue to like support our students while also maintaining safety and like precautions.
Great, thanks. And if we don't end up covering that specifically in the content, let's make a note and have a little roundtable at the end. Thanks, Kelsey. Any other hot takes or hot topics on folks' mind today? All right, well, from just a logistics perspective, I am moderately decent at monitoring chat during the presentation, so feel free to use that if you want some back channel conversation or have some questions that come up, and, you know, stop me if you have a question or something like that. Today's presentation is broken down into two major parts, and I've designed this for a mixed audience. So we're going to start off covering some fundamentals of emergency management, lessons and some discussion. And then at the end, if there's any other COVID related questions on your mind that may not be directly related to what I presented, I am hooked in pretty well in a lot of circles about COVID, and so we can have some discussion about other topics in that area too. So I think, you know, the other acknowledgement, and I've done a lot of acknowledgements, that taking a structured approach to emergency management does require some resource dedication from a personnel perspective that might not be possible at all institutions. But on the other side, in the type of business we're in, which is caring for residents in a residential environment, we all have a role in managing emergencies. And whether it's sort of that in-building sort of frontline issue all the way up to what we've just seen, which I think is the most significant emergency disaster in our careers. No matter your role, you've got a component in it. And the ability to understand the scientific approach behind it can help us have an informed, proactive response. And so the first session here in fundamentals is looking at that. The profession or trade of emergency management is really intended to protect communities through coordination, integration, and building capacity to do four things: mitigate against, prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters, acts of terrorism, etc. And that formalized process, whether it is implemented entirely or more of an informal perspective, really situates us to be on the front end of these types of things. And whether you're, like I said, you're hooked in or not, most campuses have at least one, if not more, full-time emergency management professionals that sort of look at this at an institution-wide scale. But our ability to partner with those professionals and be at the table can really help make our destiny great in these situations, if possible. So from a definitional perspective, I think it's important to think about vocabulary. There are sort of three phases of emergencies that come into play. At the lowest level, or the front line, we have what's called a hazard, which is a dangerous event or circumstance that could lead to an emergency or disaster. So that's your trip hazard, but until somebody trips, it's not actually a problem. You've got an emergency, which is a dangerous event that occurs, but can be managed at a local level. From that lens, you know, we think more of things that may happen on campus that have an emergency response and then resolved and are over with without a lot of fuss or follow-up needed. The big situation we think about are disasters, and those are significant human and economic loss, demands a really coordinated crisis response beyond the local level. And the reason that we plan for those worst case scenarios is that anything that sort of happens before that level, we're going to be ready for if we plan sort of for the worst case scenario. Let's take a second in the chat box, and within your own, wherever you live or work, what is sort of the biggest disaster scenario that your housing department or organization plans for? We all seem to have one or two things that we always hold out there saying, well, if this happens, X, Y, or Z. So let's put a couple of those in the chat. Catherine, floods. Yeah. Fire, earthquake. Yep. Earthquake's the biggie here on the Seattle campus, you know, when the big one hits. And that serves as the basis of our planning. And, you know, I think that pandemic may now raise up to that level. And, you know, a lot of us had pandemic response plans in place from the swine flu and some of the SARS response stuff, but never thought it was going to be this. So why do we have a structured approach to managing emergencies? We do that for three reasons, and they're pretty simple and intuitive if you step back and look at it. Our goal in emergency management is to reduce the loss of life first, loss of property second, harm to the environment third. And in working with our housing and food services staff here, especially our residential life team, who can get a little bit anxious about this topic, boiling it down to these three principles is one of the best things that you can do and think about, because it frames in every situation how we approach that response. You know, you think about a fire, you're going to try to get people evacuated first, then you're going to put the fire out, then you're going to clean up the mess. And that is a simple 1, 2, 3 approach without having to know an in-depth plan that really can frame our thinking. And COVID, has been the same way here. When we think about how to then engage in the formal emergency management cycle, there are 4 phases to that, and it is cyclical. And so in a good emergency management program, we have an annual review process where we revise, learn lessons, and then implement. It's a pretty standard assessment cycle, right? And so we start with preparedness, move into response, recovery, mitigation, and you can put this cycle overlaid on any particular disaster that happens and try to work through that. We're sort of straddling the response and recovery when we're talking about COVID specifically here. But I guarantee you, as we go into next year, the conversations are going to start about how to mitigate future pandemics and then be prepared should they occur. And I don't want to think about it, but we're going to have to. So boiling down these 4 phases, the preparedness or your plans or preparations made prior to an emergency occurring. Your response phase are actions taken to save lives and prevent further damage. Recovery is returning back to normal, which often isn't attended to enough. And that mitigation is how you prevent future emergencies from happening or minimize their effects. And so attending to all of these in the way that you think about emergency management in your organization is really a great way to make sure that we've covered all of our bases there. Some of the best practices, and we'll go through each phase and just talk about some best practices before we get into the COVID specific stuff here. In the preparedness area, we're really talking about planning and testing to that plan. We use the Zoom raise hand feature to let me know who has seen your campus or department's emergency management plan. Have you ever looked at that? Use the raise hand feature there. Good. We've got a couple, about half and half so far. I've seen it. And you're going to see different levels of the plan. We use at University of Washington what's called an all hazards planning model, which means that we plan for a response process versus a specific checklist of things that we do following a specific incident. Because if you plan for the fire and the flood and the earthquake and the tsunami and the volcano and the pandemic, you're going to have an office full of notebooks that aren't really relevant. But if you plan for a way to synthesize information, get the right people at the table, develop a response model, and then execute that from an all hazards perspective, regardless of what it is, you're going to be pretty successful. So then once you've got a plan in place, training to that plan is really critical. And doing exercises, whether it's a small tabletop discussion with your resident director staff or a large university-wide training where all the departments are playing in it, will help people be ready when that moment comes. And then again, the best practice is an annual update of your planning efforts. And I'm seeing some real good things come into the chat box here about different incident types. So we get into the response phase, there's some best practices there too. I think we think back to some fundamentals of incident response. And in the student housing business, we're well trained for the small things that happen, the medical emergency in the hall, the alcohol poisoning, those types of things. And I think what's really important to remember as we scale up emergencies and disasters, it's not a dissimilar process that we follow. We have the same fundamentals that occur in how you approach that situation. It's just at a different scale. So that's important to keep in mind. Here at the University of Washington, we do some pre-incident analysis for things that are known incidents. And I think that as you kind of get more integrated in this area, being able to anticipate things that might occur, for instance, if we have a major protest that is happening on campus, we start to get some intelligence on that and push it out to all of the staff in our organization so that they anticipate what might occur in their areas and have, for instance, in a dining venue, we'll have a plan of who's going to lock the doors if we need to do that. And then the ability to maintain situational awareness when something is happening often may mean that you have somebody in your organization assigned to monitor social media, for instance, and sort of pick out those things that are occurring. Having a sound communication system and a way to notify both students and your staff that something is going on is a best practice that I can't overemphasize. And it looks different in each organization, but the ability to push accurate, vetted information out in a quick fashion is really critical. You know, we found here in one incident that we tried to do an email to all 10,000 residents and saw a 30-minute lag in delivery, which you understand email infrastructure makes sense, but it was too late for us. And so that made us sort of rethink the way we do things. And then the final response best practice is having a response center model. And you know, I'm not going to go depth into the incident command system. It's one model that's used by the US federal government that's pretty well accepted, but your ability to get the right people at the table in an emergency situation to make the best decisions with the best information possible is really fundamental. And I think that sometimes we either have one person try to deal with these things or we do it in a more ad hoc basis. And I would argue that actually, you know, having a regimented routine where when you're in the heat of some type of emergency, you get representation from across your organization together will make sure that regardless of what curveballs were thrown, we're using the best talent we have to analyze and respond. And for here, you know, the way that manifested in the COVID world, we, at the start, every morning at 7:30, we had a department-wide unit response center call. And we did that for 3 months daily. And then we went to 3 times a week and then twice a week. And now we're still doing that once a week, but it provides a forum to work through that response phase. Catherine, great comment about working with your housing management system on emergency notification options. Many of them have them these days. The recovery side of things, some of the best practices are maintaining great documentation throughout the incident so that when you get to the end, if there are insurance claims or FEMA claims, that you have the backup for that. You know, for us to translate it into COVID, the CARES Act was something that we were able to take advantage of as a department because of our documentation. The business continuity planning, and I think we have stressed our business continuity systems to the max here. You know, in a perfect world, the concept is how do you continue operating in austere conditions? Well, we almost overnight sent everybody home and really stressed our remote work model and, you know, being able to be ready for that. And then debriefing and corrective action is part of that assessment cycle. The business continuity planning, you know, we here thought that we had a good business continuity plan. And the University of Washington has a process where every department's supposed to have one. And in theory, it's supposed to be sort of encapsulated and packed together where if you're not able to work on site or something happens, that you sort of have business as usual that occurs there. When we actually went to implement that, you know, we found that while we had some things written down, they weren't realistic and they weren't intended to be a 9-month, everybody in the enterprise pretty much work remotely. And so there was a lot of last minute procurement of technology and other things to allow us to do that, that now we can go back and say, okay, let's make our business continuity plan real. And so the thinking there is, you know, what type of technology do you need? What tasks have to continue? What alternate sites do you have to work? What people are critical? And then how do you have access to your documents and materials if you're not on site? Because we you know, really had some people that left on a Friday and haven't been back in 9 months. So that's important to attend to. And Dave, yeah, thanks for the comment on personal preparedness. I think the concept that none of us professionally can be expected to respond to an emergency or disaster if we haven't taken care of the things at home or our own personal life is really critical. And that's a class unto itself, but is really the pillar of all workplace emergency management efforts. So, you know, what we've just done is like in 15 or 20 minutes, giving you just sort of a glimpse of some fundamentals of what emergency management is as a art and science. And that's going to enable us here for the next 20 or 30 minutes to really dive into COVID and say, okay, what have we learned that we can take back to our own organizations? So to really level set this conversation, I want to start off with a review of how the COVID pandemic spun up. And I think that as throughout that, we have some lessons that will then set the stage for our future conversation. And so let's go back, now a year and a half ago. And, in January, late January, we had the first case of COVID documented at that point in the state of Washington and in the United States. And so it was local and it was close to home, really almost immediately. We then nearly immediately after that had a UW student under investigation. We activated our incident management team at the end of January for the first time. And then we got a negative result on that person of investigation. And we're like, whew, but if you remember at that point, nationally, internationally, and in the university housing industry, the potential impact hadn't really sunk in. I remember at the NWACUHO conference, in 2020, the Pac-12 conference down in Corvallis, we were sort of talking about this in January, February timeframe, but it didn't really seem like it was going to be what it is. And, that I attribute personally to a lot of political decisions that were made to minimize the possibility of the pandemic. And the lesson here is that had, at least in the United States, and I'm not real well briefed in what happened in Canada during this time, but in the US, the CDC had a playbook for this. And had the national political infrastructure been willing to pull out that plan, and it's back to planning, and make use of it, it would have made a world of difference. But instead, we said it's a China problem, and that was that. And as we sort of correlate that back to our organizations, think about whether you had a plan in place and whether and when you pulled that out and used it. So then we had our world turn upside down. The priorities shift in an instant. And February 29th, we had the first documented COVID death. Implemented there 4 days later, social distancing statewide. March 6th, we had the first presumed positive on campus, and then we were what was deemed campus zero, the first major university to move online. And then a week after that, we had our first COVID positive case in residence. And, being first means you make the best decisions you can with the best information available, often without evidence or information to really back that up. So, no pressure. Right. And that's sort of back to the notion of, what plan do you have in place as an organization to get the right people together to make decisions the best you can when you're in sort of this swirl. Having that incident management structure made the difference for us. And that's what we have trained for. In an incident response, you have what's called an arc of response. And on that arc, you have two arcs. It's a chart, and you've got the incident occurring where it's spinning up really fast and then sort of stabilizing and then recovering, and then your response follows a similar model. And the quicker you can get those two to cross, so the quicker you can get your response in place, the better off you're going to be. We found in retrospect and in the moment that the things we were doing and talking about in responding to COVID looked very much like the communicable disease response plan we had in place on campus. In that situation, in that plan, the worst case scenario from H1N1 flu was, we may close down for a quarter and, then come back and deal with the lost revenue and what have you. Well, at this phase of the pandemic, that's what it looked like. We all know now in retrospect that was very optimistic, but the ability for an organization to trust the planning that they had done and the willingness and courage to use that plan when you're getting the indicators that you need to can really make health and safety differences. And that was attributed back here on our campus in making some of those decisions. So then, as we know, we got in it for the long haul. So we went through March and April, all of the different things that happened, from stay home orders that, to stay home for 2 weeks to flatten the curve to, extended. And the rest is sort of history. But I think, thinking back to some of those early days, we can really draw some lessons about what our situation should be if we then encounter that again. And of course, here we are, over a year later, still at it, but significant hope on the horizon. And we're working now on planning to undo all of the things that we had done in a bit of a slower and almost as frenetic pace. So some of my observations as an emergency manager in this area impact how we apply these lessons to our own emergency management efforts. So the first thing, this has lasted much longer than we initially thought. And in pretty much every disaster planning scenario that I'm familiar with in student housing, that 1 quarter pandemic closure was sort of the worst case. Or, you've got the discrete earthquake or fire or flood that happens, and then you fix it and then you move on. But recognizing that this occurred and has been a year and a half, and that other things could stretch on and on, reframes the time horizons that we plan for and the resources that we think about and the internal care and support for both our residents and our staff. The second observation here is that we really, throughout the pandemic, in the student housing and residence life world, have flexed our planning capabilities. I would imagine that most of you have the same thing that I do, which is versions 1, 2, 3, 3.5, 3.7, 4, 10 of pretty much every situation that we encountered. And then how many times in the moment, in the day, did we have new guidance issued, a development, and you threw everything you had out and redid it? And to me, that observation then draws the correlation to the structure we put in place in our organizations to deal with that. And how are we making sure we've got the right resources to keep an eye on those and pivot, as Catherine said. I think the true priorities have emerged through this pandemic, and the benefit of on-campus living and community development is front and center. Health and safety of our workforce is front and center. Health and safety of our students are front and center. And through that, some of the other periphery stuff has fallen to the wayside. And I think that we're finding some things that may never come back into our work. And that is probably a good thing. And then finally, we're tired. I'm tired, you're tired, our students are tired. We, as I said at the start of this, will likely see what I'm calling sort of the hangover effect of the pandemic, or sort of the pent up emotional release that will occur after we're done dealing with the heat of the moment. And we just can't overemphasize, both for our workforce who have been slogging through this, but also our residents and students who are coming back to a different campus environment, what that looks like. And so while I would love to say it's going to be an easier year next year, I think there are some dynamics that we really, really need to attend to and look at organizational well-being, mental health well-being, those types of things. So 5 lessons for me as we think about our emergency management program, reflecting on the last year and a half. And we'll go through these in depth, but it's the impact of a plan, resiliency and redundancy, making a seat at the table, collaboration, and that notion of where our business continuity plan's realistic. And so with these lessons, I encourage you to sort of reframe them in your head about what your organization looks like, what your experiences look like, and how that may translate. So, many of our organizations developed pandemic response plans from H1N1. I know I was at Oregon State University at that time, and that plan has probably still got some bones in place. And those plans put us ahead of the game. The organizations that had those plans in place had a framework and a starting point of, okay, what is this whole isolation and quarantine business? What are enhanced cleaning procedures? But as you think about your organizations, ask, at that point, were your plans up to date, or had they not been touched since 2009? And did you actually pull it out and use it? And, I think those experiences may inform planning efforts moving forward of, if it's yes, and it was pretty close, as close as it could be in a unprecedented event, then you've got a good fodder to build on. If it was no, there's a lesson to go back and, document what we've experienced, so that when it happens again, hopefully in the next generation of housing professionals, that they've got a starting point. I think that having a plan, any plan in advance, can help prevent the phenomena of that analysis paralysis, which, is you're spending so much time in the moment trying to figure out what to do that you separate and don't make a decision. And I mentioned earlier, at our institution, we had to make some pretty tough decisions without really good information to back it up. But the plan that we had and had developed and had been vetted campus-wide helped inform the decisions that were being made. And that planning gets you ahead of the game so that you're not swaying in the wind when something occurs. Even if the majority of the plan gets thrown out the window, you still have a structure in place for elements of pandemic response. And the ability to rely on it then says, okay, we don't need to focus on, how we communicate or this or that. And you can really get into the unique elements of that incident, which was COVID and serving our residents. So I implore you to think about what additional planning is needed in your organizations while these lessons are fresh. And I'd also say, as much as it's difficult to think about, while this is fresh, actually implement a process in your organizations to document these lessons from the pandemic and figure out, both from an incident response side, but also just from an organizational practice side, what did we learn during the pandemic that we want to carry forward? And that can be really transformational in an organization. I forgot, as I was trying to draw with my fingers, what this incident response arc looks like, but this is that example that planning efforts bridge the gap between when an incident occurs and the response, which means you could be more proactive in decisions. In a situation like this pandemic, where it felt like we were walking on quicksand every day and the circumstances were changing by the hour, having that prescribed incident management process was critical for us. It meant that I knew every morning I had all of the right people around a virtual table where we could download information, we could try ideas on for size, we could identify priorities, and then move on for the actions of that day, and then do it again and rinse and refresh. And in a more ambiguous cycle, I think we've all experienced the effort that turns into 3 million emails and 4 million email chains and responses, and you just can't keep up. And so you sort of cut through that and be willing to say, no, we're in an active incident, even though it's 3, 4, 5 months, and we're going to act like it. Incidentally, it's a different class altogether, but the notion of an emergency operations center is really relevant here. And I'll admit that at our institution-wide level, we did not do a super job of executing the plans we had in place enterprise-wide. And there are some reasons behind that, but it ended up putting our environmental health and safety office here responsible for not only the public health role, which they are supposed to play, but also the incident management role, which is a little bit outside of their bailiwick. But in our housing department, it was different, and we did what we had written down, and it worked relatively well. So think about the impact of a plan and what additional plans you need to put in place in your organizations. The second big lesson is the resiliency and redundancy. And I think these, the word resiliency is thrown around quite a bit, but when you kind of dig into it from a sort of the mental health and social work and public health perspective, there's some real important lessons. And, without a doubt, this has been and continues to be a long haul. And did our plans consider an incident lasting over a year? We've got our gas tanks, metaphorically speaking, are relatively full at the start of an incident. And then you know, have the ability to step on that gas for a little while, burn hard, and then burn out. And this was so much longer of a situation, and making sure that we have plans in our groups. And, you know, this can even apply to a long on-call week in residential life of how are we caring for the people that are helping others. And, you know, do you require your on-call staff to be in the office at 7 o'clock the next day if they, you know, were up at 2 in the morning dealing with a mental health concern, you know, even down to that level. But, you know, you sort of extrapolate that, and we need to think about this as organizations. The organizational resiliency approach sort of thinks about that redundancy of, you know, staff and responders. Are you in a position to have somebody take over if somebody in a critical role is unable to fulfill their duties for whatever reason? And, you know, this was extremely salient for me personally early in the pandemic, when March of 2000, I contracted COVID, and I was our incident commander for COVID. I was the first person in our organization. Should get a little badge for that. And thankfully it wasn't a severe case, but overnight, you know, I was out of the picture. And thankfully our housing department uses a 3D model for people filling emergency response roles. So we had the ability to pivot, but we don't always sort of think about that. We also should think about, from a resiliency perspective, who's in charge, and have you freed up time on that person's plate or those people's plate to focus on your response efforts. You know, we don't all have emergency managers on staff. And even me, you know, it's like 15% of my job, and I've got 5 or 10% of another manager. And from a program perspective, that's it. But when the pandemic hit, we formed a structure and tried to free up time for people to really, you know, focus on that. And you know, for a period of time, 75% of my weeks were in COVID related meetings, and that's thankfully gone down progressively. But our organization has recognized the benefit of having an integrated presence at all of the different tables, so to speak. And so I've been able to stay up on everything COVID and then feed that back to the organization. That wouldn't be possible if there wasn't an organizational commitment to not just pile on other duties, as Dave noted. So that's really important. And then a focus on personal resiliency. This is just sort of my philosophical take on our industry as a whole, but recognizing that in situations like this, job expectations are significantly different, and we need to call it out, recognize it, respond to it. In the pandemic and in other emergency situations, there's a personal impact for the people that make our organizations tick. And whether that's a family member that's sick or has passed away or has lost a job, that there isn't this clean separation between Josh, COVID incident commander, or you know, Catherine, occupancy manager, and the personal life. Burnout is very real, and I think is becoming more real. And then I think we all should consider how we attend to mental first aid or that Green Cross support as part of our response model. And so once you get through a major incident, then how are you going back and tending to the people through debriefing, post-traumatic stress, critical incident stress debriefing, and sort of focusing on that. And then the final thing, sort of in this resiliency redundancy, you know, think about what capabilities you have in your organization to manage multiple incidents that may occur at once. You know, I reflect back to our residence hall move-in last year, and granted, it was significantly smaller than a normal year. You had the COVID overlay. We had a major flood that occurred outside of one of our buildings during move-in. We had forest fires with degraded air quality, and an apartment fire that all occurred sort of at the same time. And so you can't expect your same person or people to be sort of all things to all people there. So in your planning efforts, make sure you've got 1, 2, and 3 backups. So the third lesson from the pandemic is really the benefit of making a seat at the metaphorical table. And, you know, the Hamilton reference I just love. I want to be in the room where it happens. And being integrated into campus emergency management, response, and health and safety programs prior to an incident establishes the credibility of you and your organization and gives you a seat at the table when things are going down. In this case, in a really salient example in our institution, the TLC we put into those relationships and attending the meetings and just doing the things we do as good professionals prevented high-level administrators at our institution from making decisions that impacted the housing program without us being involved. And that isn't the case everywhere. I've heard from a lot of colleagues that have articulated that decisions about housing in the pandemic were made in a room and dictated to the housing department. And that doesn't take into account our body of professional knowledge. It doesn't take into account our understanding of students and student behavior and student needs, and doesn't take into account the notion that oftentimes, campus housing might be the best or safest option for people. And so, the more that you can lay the groundwork to make your department part of the decision versus having the decision dictated upon you. While it might seem as other duties as assigned in our job, your department is well served to have a designated emergency management point of contact who dedicates some of their time on a routine basis to being integrated into the campus fabric. And it's more than just what we do in our residential life areas of student care team. That those types of things are sort of relevant in similar circles, but you want to find, who are your environmental health and safety folks, who are your emergency management practitioners, and how can you make sure that you understand how decisions are made in those types of situations and position your organization to be involved. The fourth lesson is what I call collaboration without reliance. And, in emergency response efforts, collaboration with campus partners is critical to our success. For instance, in the pandemic, we needed our public health partners to develop the guidance that we follow. We're not the experts in that. But that collaboration does not absolve us as student housing professionals from our responsibility to our residents and our employees. So, being the proverbial bee in the bonnet at the campus level when necessary, while working within institutional parameters and structures, you shouldn't always just wait for something to be dictated. So if we saw early in the pandemic, our workforce was significantly, particularly custodial, concerned about being on campus without personal protective equipment. And this was before it was readily available. And so, one approach would have been to wait for campus to solve the problem for the campus, but the other approach was for us to go source our own and be scrappy about it. And we chose to do that. And so I would say, you want to make sure you work within the right structure, but if there is an issue that is impacting your population or your staff, either work that eagerly towards resolution or take responsibility and accountability to resolve it yourself. We're also, the student housing experts, and in many circles, we're the student development experts that might be sitting around a table. And so being able to articulate in collaborative relationships what student needs are is, I think, really a big benefit. Being good campus partners is also important. And, our own plans at the University of Washington had always indicated that it was unlikely we could help non-residents in a big disaster. But in this case, we had the capability, and we have been able to help with isolation and quarantine housing for off-campus and setting up vaccine sites and setting up testing sites. And there are a lot of other areas of expertise that housing professionals bring that can be lent to campus efforts, which in the pandemic then had a knock-on effect of benefiting our residents and organizations. Think about problem solving, logistics, project management, navigating campus, incident response. Those are all things that, your workforce can potentially offer back. And you don't want to do it to the detriment, but I think we oftentimes are sort of unwilling to take on extra responsibilities for good reason, but sometimes it can be very strategic to collaborate, because then it, makes sure that you're back at the table, or you have access to the right resources, or, really selfishly, I loved putting on vaccine clinics here because it meant that our residents had access to vaccine a little bit earlier than some of the other population might. So, think about when it's appropriate to collaborate, but don't always rely in your planning on others to make the right decision for your own sphere of influence. And then, we talked about the business continuity plan, but dusting off that business continuity plan is really important. And I think, remote work is here to stay in some respect, and we need to go back and sort of right size our resources and technology to that, because ultimately, when you talk about disaster response and incident management, the ability to execute those functions from nearly anywhere is the best thing that you can do and think about, because you're not reliant on a physical environment, a building or a room being safe to come to. So we, think about that. And Dave, I really appreciate your comment about, preparing the essential workers and elevating their needs. Our dining staff, our custodial staff, who have been throughout the whole pandemic and in most situations are expected to continue on the front line. And sometimes they don't necessarily receive the level of attention or TLC that we need. So I want to open up for a little bit of discussion here as we start to move towards the end, and pose a question. And folks are welcome to unmute and just share any thoughts on how your department or organization has approached management and recovery in the pandemic. And do you think it followed or deviated from the plans you had in place? And there's no right or wrong answer, so don't be shy about sharing your thoughts. Any observations?
Yeah, maybe I can just share a little bit. Thank you so much, Josh. It was interesting we have emergency response committee. That's I'm here at Ambrose in Calgary. And what I noticed is kind of neat how you said being in the room where it happened. I was on that committee at one point, and then then just the VP, so my supervisor, she was on the committee. And I noticed that the action plan, you could say, to COVID-19, it just kept changing. So that was a little, as you could say, just when you thought you had it all figured out, and like the response, it was constantly, and you got to be gracious to that. It's constantly evolving, but that not knowing the why, or like why it's being changing, was a little bit. So that's something I noticed, that how we'd respond to close contact, or the expectations for, well, now we're doing it. It was hard to keep that all straight, but just a small thing that I noticed.
Yeah, and that's frustrating too, right? Sometimes the changes didn't make sense, and other times it's like literally day to day, the health guidance is different. Who else has some observations about, how your department or approached this, and whether you think it followed your pre-existing plans?
Yeah, so for us, it was really interesting because when COVID hit, we were only in our second year of operation. And so while we had like general incident plans, they had all very, very recently been developed. And our department had only had 2 staff members for about 7 months at the time. So it was both this mixture of like, let's figure out like what of our departmental incident management like needs to change, and also kind of, well, we barely know what we're doing anyway, so let's just like keep going and eventually we'll figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, and I think if anything, this year has solidified some things that can go on the to-do list for especially newer organizations. Any other hot takes on this question?
I think, oh, sorry, Dave, I'll be fast. So I'm in Calgary as well, at Mount Royal University, and I think what we learned to some degree is we can't really tie what we're doing to our provincial standards, because they were changing very rapidly, and we basically did more most of the time than what the provincial standards required, because our province, like some places in the States, was in a bit of denial, I think, initially around a lot of this, and the push wasn't necessarily how we would have maybe done it had we been in those rooms. So we basically just said what we were going to do and stuck to it. And I basically gave up trying to plan long term because things just kept changing. So it was basically, what can we do in the moment at this time? It makes sense for us. And then campus was good. Campus was good in supporting that. So we were okay to kind of say, we know what the provincial restrictions are. We're actually going to go more restrictive than that where we think it's important. Because initially we were similar to you, Josh. We were kind of going with, this is our infectious disease protocol. And then that got thrown out the window pretty fast when we realized what we were actually dealing with. So that was that was kind of our piece, because some departments on campus were planning with every change in restrictions that the province would roll out, and they're on version 37 at this point and still going. So
that's great. I appreciate everybody's perspectives there. So, the other thing we've mentioned is I really can't overemphasize the benefit of doing an after-action review process for responses like this, of what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, what can we learn from it, and then how do we move forward. So consider that, and if you need any resources offline, let me know. We're not going to do a small group breakout because we're getting a little short on time, but also, just some things to take home. Think about how these lessons can be applied to our planning for the future and what advice you might have for the next generation responding to a pandemic. And then my spread hope, not COVID, or as someone else in a meeting I'm in routinely says, stay positive and test negative. But want to open it up. I think we've got 3 or 4 minutes left here to take any questions, or if you have any hot topics you want to get into, I'd open that up. Any burning questions?
Yeah, I had something, Josh. By the way, I still miss you.
Nice beard.
Yeah, it's just starting. It's only since December. But the question, or the thing that I found as an employee, was that our leadership really tried to be transparent about what was going on and regular communications, so that it made at least one thing less crazy. So we kind of knew where the institution was going, who was working on what, things like that. And to have that told in words that made sense, and it was deep. It wasn't just like, we're working hard, thank you. It's really why they're doing some of the things they're doing, so that could answer some basic questions that we could then possibly explain to others in our staff and things like that. That lowered the freakiness, I'd say 70% for me personally. So I think communications to everyone in your staff, and then reaching out to those who don't use the standard email, Zoom thing, so that they also get informed, such as our frontline workers and custodians and dining staff. I found that was key.
I think that's right on the mark, Dave. And that, that's reflective generally of good leadership practices, but in a crisis situation, it's all the more important, because in a lack of information, people will make up their own story. And to be able to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, really acknowledges that. And I'm not going to get into too much of a comparison, but I think that as an institution, Oregon State did a better job at managing this than UW did. Oregon State designated a cabinet level COVID response coordinator and put a process and structure into place, whereas we sort of were more decentralized. What else?
I've been surveying occupancy management professionals for an NWACUHO session about COVID and things learned. And so I see a lot of correlation between campuses who had housing represented at the conversations across campus about COVID, and how that trickled down to both action plans that had to happen or rehappen for occupancy management, and also how staff felt about how they were represented in those conversations. And it's fascinating to think about how all this is interconnected, and the burnout that you were talking about and the mental health, I think is really, really, really going to be something we'll need to address in our staff moving forward as we go into this busy fall where it's going to be this renaissance, so to speak, of energy that's been pent up for a year and a half of all these students coming to campus, and the staff are traumatized and exhausted and still having to maintain all operations.
That's a great drop the mic final comment, I think, Catherine. My email address is on the screen, and I welcome anybody to reach out if you've got anything else. It's great to see you all, and I'll turn it back over to Becca.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josh. I think that was super helpful and really interesting to hear kind of how different institutions are working through everything. So thank you again for presenting, and thank you everyone for coming. The link is in the chat for the First Friday webinar feedback sheet, as well as the professional development email if you are interested in presenting or know someone who might be. And that's about it. So thank you all for coming, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Have a great Friday. Thanks.